these really strange times, but we are excited to be continuing with some of the most pertinent discussions and seminars that we have always had. Today is a very special event. About a year ago, we had the UIC Urban Forum. That was a half a day or day long affair with panelists from the industry and from the private sector and the public sector, talking about an emerging topic, if you will, that was on the autonomous vehicles and its future and its role in society. And the Urban Forum has been a signature event for the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. This past year's theme was on transportation, and that's where the Transportation Center got roped in. And I was able to steer that event. The Urban Forum also has an academic component, apart from the day long event that we have in person. We also, since the last year or so, we have reached out to eminent scholars around the country to chime in on the topic for that particular year. In this case, autonomous vehicles was the topic for 2019. So we reached out to a few scholars around the nation and had them write white papers, which will be put together in a compendium and be published by the University of Illinois Press, coming to a store near you soon. Right. And the idea then was to have these scholars visit UIC and share their thoughts and presentation about what they are finding as they continue their research work and experiences. And so it will be a back and forth was what we had visioned. And strange set of events happened, and now we are here about a year later. This is the latest we have gone before inviting the panel members to come and do a presentation. But better late than never, they say. And so I'm very happy to have two of our white paper authors join us today to give their presentations and engage in a discussion with us on what they contributed to the compendium that the University of Illinois Press is going to be putting out soon. And when it comes out, we'll definitely make sure to let you know. I don't know where and how you can get a copy of it, but I'm sure we'll disseminate that information as and when it becomes available. Correct, Jenny? And I will be remiss if I don't acknowledge the excellent teamwork that Jenny Sweeney, Jenny, you can wave. Jenny Sweeney and Ed Berry from the college have been the pillars of making sure there are no glitches and touch wood, and both in the in-person event and for this panel discussion, they've been the ones that have been carrying the bulk of the weight. I'm just here to just do a show and tell, right? So thank you to both of you for making this event happen. And thank you to both our speakers. And before I get them to talk about their work, I will introduce both of them now. Our first speaker is Stan Caldwell. He's the Executive Director of the Mobility 21 University Transportation Center at Carnegie Mellon University. And Stan has been with Carnegie for a number of years now. He's also an adjunct faculty member in the School of Public Policy and Management, correct, Stan? And he has his degrees from the Pennsylvania area, master's in public policy, and a bachelor's in resource management, all from the state of Pennsylvania. And he's going to be talking about a very whimsical title, Are We There Yet? All of us can relate to that to some extent in various contexts. And our second speaker is Dr. Austin Lance Brown from UC Davis. and Austin is similar to Stan, is the executive director of the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and Economy at the University of California, Davis. And Austin is also similar to Stan, is an adjunct professor in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department at UC Davis, and also has another hat as an adjunct instructor at Johns Hopkins, where he worked prior to joining UC Davis, I believe. And then he has also had multiple roles in federal government, dating back to the Obama administration, in the clean energy and transportation, as an assistant director, and then in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, all going back to the last 10 years Austin has been. And then if I can just give another personal peek into Austin's busy life, he's also the proud father of a newborn that is up and running right now. And just like Stan told me, he's got a pet right under the desk. We can be surprised by Austin's newborn anytime now, if possible, maybe. So without further ado, I would like to invite Stan to give us his presentation. Stan, you can share your screen. The way I vision this is I've asked each of these scholars to keep their presentations short, and after Austin is done, we'll have, after Stan is done, Austin will give his talk, and then we'll open it up for questions and engage in a discussion. Please post all your questions on the chat box. We are muting everyone for the sake of just not messing up with technology. And please be careful with your audio and video. Because there could be any number of things that could go awry. Without further ado, Stan, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Been looking forward to this for over a year now. I was looking forward to the train trip. There's a great overnight train from Pittsburgh to Chicago, which I greatly enjoy taking. And so hopefully when things lift, we'll be able to visit soon. But we really appreciate this opportunity today. And so, as Dr. Sriraj said, our focus on our white paper was, are we there yet? And where is it that we need to go? Really looking at the myths and realities of connected and automated vehicles. We always look at, the parallel paths of automation. My research is, for years, has been focused on the disruptive technologies in transportation, and automated vehicles are just one of them. Of course, you have electric vehicles, connected vehicles, shared vehicles, all these other parallel disruptions happening at the same time. But of course, this white paper mostly focused on automated vehicles. But I have to acknowledge my co-author, Chris Hendrickson, who's also at the Traffic 21 Institute and our University Transportation Center, and on my research as well, who greatly contributed to this. And as Sriraj mentioned, I'm with the Mobility 21 University Transportation Center. And so this today's presentation is a good opportunity of 3 university transportation centers collaborating on work together. And so we're happy to work with our fellow UTCs. It's a great federal program, and we're happy to be a part of it. So at Carnegie Mellon University, our perspective on automated vehicles goes back to the early days in the 1980s, is when the early research began. The picture in the bottom right is of what we call the Tarrigator, which was the first automated vehicle that was created in 1984. So this it goes way back, but of course the first documented concept of automated vehicles goes back to 1939. So almost as long as we've had vehicles, we've been dreaming about when they're going to be automated. And the running joke in the industry had always been that they're always 20 years away. And so we saw that in even 1995 was the first time we did it was called No Hands Across America. The younger people on this call won't recognize the play on Hands Across America at that time, but No Hands Across America was the first cross-country trip from, I believe it was Pittsburgh to San Diego. And that's when that's when the idea the vehicles on the ground really took some root. And then in 2007, the Department of Defense's DARPA Urban Grand Challenge, that was the third of the automated vehicle grand challenges, kind of culminated. And Department of Defense said, wow, we do believe this technology is ready for the commercial world. And that's when we got into what I call the dark ages of when there were companies. This is when Waymo began. Of course, it was still just under Alphabet at that time. And a lot of the other companies like GM and Toyota, and everyone had their kind of secret skunk works of automated vehicles happening, but it was all kept very quiet until 2013. And this is when, everyone started coming out and the race began, and everyone started to saying, we're going to have automated vehicles in 2017 or 2019 or 2020. And, the actual commercial race began at that time. And then we saw the peak of the hype cycle, because then it really became a lot of hype at that time. And again, because these companies were competing with each other, both new entrants and traditional auto companies. And with the tragic fatality in Tempe, Arizona, was kind of when we saw the end of that hype cycle. And today, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, is really looking at where are we now. And a lot has just really evolved just this year in automated vehicle technology, in the industry trends. And that's what a lot of my research is too, just kind of tracking these trends in the industry, not just both from a technical side, but from the policy developments as well. So first of all, we have automated vehicles today. We have vehicles that are operating in level 1, level 2 automation, and they are currently saving lives, and they are also saving money. And so we have research from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and there was earlier research from one of my colleagues, Corey Harper, looking at this as well. So we do have automated vehicles today. It's early automation, but the automation is saving lives and it is saving money. So that's significant. There is kind of a race right now for this next level 3 automation. And I know Austin will get into the levels more in his presentation, but at this level 3, this is, again, commercial automation that is in the vehicles today that we can go out and purchase. And Mercedes-Benz just announced, their plans for deploying their level 3. They say it's ready and it's just pending the legal approval. And of course, Tesla has level 2, arguably level 2 to level 3 out today. And Elon Musk keeps promising every few months level 5 automation is just around the corner. So, but again, these are very, automated vehicles that we can go out and purchase today. And then this article just came out in the Median just a few days ago on the 16th. But really looking at, Waymo has now put an automated vehicle service out there that has no driver behind the wheel, serving 500,000 people with, an autonomous taxi with no driver behind the wheel. I mean, it's still in a limited area with limited deployment and limited capability, but it's a big step that we have a truly driverless taxi on the road today operating for public use, not just in a beta test or, this is still testing, but this is out there for public use. But we're also seeing a major shift just in the last 6 months, towards delivery vehicles and larger freight vehicles. And so a lot of this, I think, was spurred with kind of our drastic shopping habits because of COVID-19, but we're seeing a lot more from the delivery vehicle side. And this can be anywhere from the cute little sidewalk vehicles to, Amazon looking at automated vehicles to help with their delivery vans. And then, of course, we're seeing a lot of of heavy trucks now in a lot of companies, mostly in the Southwest around New Mexico and Texas being tested there. But you can see the list here where Locomation, 4U, Too Simple, Waymo, Daimler, deploying, testing these trucks on the road. So this is what we're seeing out there today. So there is a lot of industry collaboration that's starting as well, looking at some standards for the evaluation of safety of these vehicles with through UL 4600, which was through Underwriters Laboratories, the Society of Automotive Engineers, Safety Vehicle Consortium. On the connected vehicle side, the 5G Automotive Association, PAVE, the Partners for Automotive Vehicle Education, was an organization where automated vehicle companies are coming together in order to better educate the public about this technology. And one thing significant that also came out this year was groups like AAA, Society of Automotive Engineers, J.D. Powers, Consumer Reports, and National Safety Council got together around standard terminology. We were getting the public was getting a lot of confusing technology about existing automated features that are in the cars today. And what this was standardizing that terminology so that we understand something like in the past, like cruise control. You say cruise control, we all understand what that is, but in these new features of lane departure or object detection, there were a lot of confusing terms, and people were having too high of expectations of what the technology could do in some cases. Now, with that said, I mentioned that there was industry collaboration, but there's still continued industry shuffling. And this is why I argued that right now the industry is not settled enough to kind of understand who are the big leaders in this. You have so much disruption with both the startup companies, the new technology companies, and the traditional automotive companies that there's still a lot of both partnerships and mergers and acquisitions. I say this looks more like a high school dance at this time, where you have Mercedes and BMW dissolving their partnership, and then Mercedes then partners with NVIDIA, and Hyundai and Aptiv create Motional, and Yandex and Uber spin off an AV unit, and then Volkswagen breaks with Aurora, and then Ford and Volkswagen partner on their technology with Argo AI, which is another AV company. So again, we're just continuing to see lots and lots of shuffling within the industry, and I think that's what makes it very difficult to see a distinct path forward, because everyone is concerned about their market position. Now, from the federal government side, we're seeing initiatives coming out of the Federal Highway Administration, like CARMA, which is a cooperative automation initiative. NHTSA just released this year under Secretary Child, the AV Test Initiative, where they're trying to coordinate all of the AV testing that's happening all across the United States. And the Federal Communications Commission also is looking at reallocating the connected vehicle spectrum for using dedicated short-range communications radio. So I think because of the industry continued disruption, the federal government has been reluctant under this administration, and the previous administration has still been reluctant to really step in and heavily regulate the industry. And we're seeing that both, again, with the administration and with Congress, as legislation has been stalled from Congress as well. So what that's done is that's created the situation where states need to have developed their own policy, and a lot of it has been a patchwork of policy. And some of it has been legislation, some of it has been policy, some of it has been executive order. And so it makes it difficult for the companies to navigate, but we're seeing that happen. We're also seeing, I'm involved with what we call the Smart Belt Coalition, which is a automated and connected vehicle test bed with the 3 states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio that have come together to try to look at both policy and technology issues of having a multi-state deployment of automated vehicle technology. City of Pittsburgh came up with what they call the Pittsburgh Principles, which was a cooperative agreement between the 5 automated vehicle testers in the city of Pittsburgh and the city government and the mayor to try to develop a framework of again, based on voluntary compliance with the companies of how, how this technology should be deployed with good policy in mind. And, but we're also seeing Michigan announced the first automated vehicle lanes from Detroit to Ann Arbor just last month. So we're seeing a lot of activity still evolving on the local, state, and regional level, because that's where we're seeing deployments across the United States, but it's being done in a patchwork. And the final point I want to make with this is that, who says the goal is a truly driverless car? When we look at level 5 automation, where we have nobody in the vehicle, is that really necessary? Commercial partial automated systems, as we already said, are already saving lives and money. If the promise of automated vehicles is reducing the crashes that are caused by over 90% human error, if we can be applying good level 3, 2, 3, 4 automation and saving the lives, do we really need to have level 5 automation? And right now we have enough public policy issues with single occupancy vehicles. Do we really want zero occupancy vehicles? The idea of a vehicle is to be either moving people or goods around. Do you really want to have vehicles, riding around without anybody in them? And the whole idea of, should artificial intelligence support human activity or replace it? There's a big perception and often fear that artificial intelligence will replace human activity, whether it's human jobs or any of our human activity. But, I argue that artificial intelligence, computers are very good at doing repetitive tasks over and over without getting bored. Humans are very good at applying common sense to situations they haven't encountered. So they actually work very well together. And what we're finding with the automated vehicle technology is that it works it can work very well in limited situations, but to have a vehicle out there just randomly operating, encountering all different types of scenarios, the computers cannot handle that type of unfamiliar information the way humans can. And so, so I argue we may never need level 5 automation if we can apply the right types of policies to the technology we have. So I'll be happy to turn it over to Austin at this point.
Thank you, Stan. As Austin is transitioning over to share his presentation, I want to acknowledge that the other, so we had 4 white papers as part of the University of Illinois compendium that is coming out. One of them was written by Professor Kazuya Kawamura from the College of Urban Planning, and he's written about freight and automation and logistics and freight logistics and automation. And I have contributed the introduction chapter, overview chapter to that white paper, to that compendium that is coming out. And the editor for the compendium is going to be Dean Pagano. And I don't know if Kazuya or Mike are on the Zoom meeting, but regardless, I think look out for the compendium with contributions from not just these academicians that we are having the pleasure of talking to us, but also a couple of UIC names will also be on that compendium.
Raj, this is Mike Pagano. I just want to welcome everybody and say hello, but also to say that the book will be arriving fairly soon. And if anybody would like to have a hard copy, which is an unusual thing for these times, but if you like a hard copy of the book, please send your mailing address to, can they send it to you, Sri Raj?
Yeah.
Okay, send it to you, and Jenny will get the book sent out to you. Thank you.
They can send it to me, or they can copy Ed Berry at UTC, and then either one of us will be able to transfer the information to Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thanks, Mike. Austin?
Great, thank you. And thanks, Stan, for that great overview. I think it really helps complement what I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit more on the policy side, but really relies on the fundamental understanding of where the industry might be going, and maybe more importantly, how little we know about where it might be going. I do need to share a photo. I'll do it on my phone because I resisted the urge to put it in my slides. But since Professor Sriraj mentioned that this is my little guy, he wasn't even born when we started talking about this stuff, and he's not really even a newborn anymore. So he's almost 9 months old, and he's blissfully unaware of all the things going on in the world. And I think the automation link is he still has only ever been in electric vehicles, but we'll see if he ever needs to have a driver's license even for those vehicles. So by the time he's driving, what will the transportation system look like? I think these are interesting questions. So the main point I want to make is about impacts and how we should be thinking about getting policy in place before things start happening. So this pattern, which I think Stan really alluded to in a slightly different context of the hype cycle, is first the technology doesn't exist, then it's exciting, it's coming out of the lab, people are writing about it, it's going to change the world, it's going to change everything, it gets all this press. Then it doesn't live up to expectations and everybody sort of forgets about it. And then if it's a good, viable, useful technology, it sort of will enter into the marketplace. And then by the time it's out there, we've forgotten to get the right policy in place to actually make sure that that technology has social benefits and makes people's lives better in reality. We can think about many innovations of the last 100 years as fitting into this category. I think we could look at what's going on now with social media and realizing that oops, maybe we didn't get the right kind of rules in place when these things were small, and now they're very large, and it takes many congressional hearings even to begin a conversation about how should we actually think about regulating these things. And I think the same thing is going to be true about automated vehicles, where we're really in that stage, as Stan pointed out, of post-peak hype cycle, but where these things are still moving forward. And so it's very much worth having this conversation about policy to demand that these technologies create benefits, widespread benefits. I'm going to mention the 5 stages of automation. I assume that based on the sophistication of the group that most people have some familiarity with them. I really like this way to talk about them because it goes from sort of driver, human driven, to feet off, which is like cruise control, hands off, which is like lane keeping. And that's kind of where the technologies are today. But then you get to this big jump when you go into 3 and 4, where in 3 you can start to take your eyes off the road, and in 4 you can stop paying attention, and this is fully automated for some uses and some trips. So that's that big leap that we're looking at, and I bring these up here mostly because the effects I'm talking about are really the ones that manifest at stages 3 and 4. And I fully agree with Stan's point that lower levels of automation are incredibly important. They have a lot of effects. But some of these bigger societal transformation effects we think will probably manifest at these high levels of automation. So trying to think ahead to what some of those impacts might be. My main goal here is to get us to stop thinking about this question, which is probably the one I get asked the most on panels, which is, when will self-driving cars be here? And when people ask this, they're well-intentioned, but they usually don't even know what they mean by here. As Stan pointed out, they're already here. They usually mean something else, though. And then honestly, the real answer to this question is nobody knows anyway. So these are 2, I intentionally don't cite these because I sort of pulled them from 2 very outlier studies and don't want to embarrass them since especially the high scenario looks like it's looking particularly crazily optimistic at this point. But there's this enormous range of estimates out there. So on the left, both of these charts are showing estimated future passenger miles traveled. And then sort of the blue is a conventional sort of how we travel today. And then the orange on top is through transportation, so automated transportation as a service. So being driven around in a self-driving car. And there's just this enormous range. I was able to find 6 different studies, and they've ranged from just a few % by 2030 of being automated to, up at the 95%, which, looks like a much faster transformation than is in the cards. This is published, each of these were published several years ago. So again, I'm not trying to say one of these studies is right and one of them is wrong. My point is the estimates out there are so big and so wide, and they're trying to make forecasts for a combination of technological progress and human behavior and acceptance that just makes this a futile exercise. And it's really too bad that we don't know, because these really matters, and it really matters how this transformation happens. So to try to illustrate why it matters, not just when and if this transformation to high levels of automation happens, but really how it happens, I'm going to describe sort of two futures that are both pretty good for the individual person involved. So in the sort of first future, let's say the person has access to automated transportation, but chooses to live near work, maybe in a city center, if we still get to live in city centers in the future. Housing is pricey, but transportation is very affordable. So this person subscribes to mobility as a service and has a range of options. So mostly they're able to walk or use transit, but when they need to, they have a backup automated electric vehicle as an option, or if they're taking a longer trip, can use a service to rent a vehicle for those longer trips, larger vehicles for sharing with friends. And then critically, after the vehicle that serves this need drops the customer off, it moves on to the next customer. So it's serving many people. We think of this as a pooled or shared fleet model, which is very different from the personal ownership model we have today. This is sounds like a pretty great life to me, that you have access to all these mobility options at beck and call, and it overall is relatively affordable. But that's just not compatible with the individual ownership model that we have for vehicles today if you begin to automate those. So you now consider the same person, but rather than sort of living near work and subscribing to this mobility as a service option, this person now lives far away where housing is very affordable, and then owns their own self-driving gasoline-powered car. So a commute to work might be 100 miles. That's actually pretty potentially viable, where you maybe have faster travel on the highway until you get into the congested region around the city, where the person, if you don't have to pay attention, you can watch a movie, you can catch up on your email on the way to work, you can have breakfast, take a nap. All of these things that are potentially nice benefits would mean that it would no longer be a barrier to live as far away from destinations as it currently is today. So this commute is then many, many miles. And then after dropping off the person at work, the car could then drive itself out of the city center to go park, which creates additional miles, those empty miles, the dreaded empty miles or zombie miles that Stan mentioned earlier. So both of these futures provide great service to the person, but the effect on the society is gigantic. So in the second future, where if you have a lot of people doing this, the people who can afford it are going to be able to have access to those services. The people who can't are still going to pay the costs of the traffic, of the pollution, and of the sort of continued exit from the city and lack of investment in those urban centers. So while both provide good service, they have very different societal consequences. And that's where we think about policy as having a role. We could think about this also as having extreme effects on land use. Automated vehicles could both enable car-free living, but they could also enable affordable super sprawl with all of the different consequences that come with that. So the total effects, we don't know the impact level, but we also don't even know the direction and the sign of the impact. And that's going to come up again in my next example of these key impacts we need to consider. So these are from a series of papers, some of which I wrote and some of which were by other authors, looking at the effects of high levels of automation on energy use. And I'll just mention a few of these because I don't want to go into detail and take up all of the time with that. But we found that there's many effects, especially effects on demand from automation, that could increase energy use. So it makes travel easier. It opens up transportation to some underserved communities, like like the elderly, the children, and people with disabilities, which is obviously a huge benefit, but also has an effect on energy use. You have these empty miles we talked about. You can potentially travel faster, which reduces efficiency. And then there's a bunch of potential efficiency benefits where you can right-size the vehicle for the trip rather than having a vehicle that is useful for all trips. You can potentially platoon and get efficiencies from that. You can smooth out travel. So we found all of these effects, some of which will decrease energy use, some of which will increase energy use. And when we put them all together, we found that not only did we not know the size of the impact, we couldn't even estimate the sign. Would this reduce energy use or would it increase energy use? And it really depended on some key factors that I'll mention in a minute. Now, I'm using energy as an example here, but the exact same principle applies to the other transportation impacts we care about. We don't know whether these vehicles will be positive for equity. We don't know whether these vehicles will be positive for congestion. They can improve traffic efficiency, but if they improve VMT more than they do that, you could actually have pretty negative effects on overall congestion and traffic. So each of these consequences really depends on the way that these vehicles manifest themselves in our transportation system. And the biggest factors, especially for energy use, are will we share these highly automated vehicles or own our own? And then a secondary question of will these vehicles be electric? Because if they're electric, you obviously have much better emissions outcomes. Although I should point out, electrification is a very big benefit from a climate perspective, but it doesn't solve your equity or congestion problems at all. So we need to always be thinking about the whole array of transportation priorities when considering these policies. Okay, so if the wrong question was when they're going to be here, I think the right question is what do we do now to get ready for this, however the technology manifests. And here we always like to say policy is the tool by which we exert collective action, right? That's what public policy is. It's a group of people deciding to do something together. And that's what I'll spend the last few minutes on. So in the white paper, I wrote the forthcoming white paper, we looked at a bunch of different policy needs. This is just a sort of a high level summary of them. It ended up being really a lot of the paper. And we were like, oh man, we are recommending so many individual policy needs. This is going to be a long haul. So we looked at the need to establish clear governance structures. Who does what? Stan mentioned in his remarks that we've seen a lack of federal leadership on this topic, and then there's complicated interlocking roles for states and local governments as well. So we really need to figure out who's doing what in the transportation system. Right now, as the most common example, right now, the federal government is responsible for the safety of the vehicle and the state is responsible for the driver. Well, what about when the vehicle is the driver? It becomes much more complex. I always like to point out we need to implement flexible frameworks. So we're never going to get the policy exactly right now for something that isn't even widely available yet. So we need to put in place these priorities and then have policy frameworks that can adapt to the reality of the technology as it deploys. And then encourage continual improvement. So we shouldn't expect these vehicles to be perfect the day that they're widely available, but we should set policies that mean that you're always asking every year for the vehicles to get safer and more effective and bring more benefits. And then lastly, we'll need to modernize our infrastructure to be prepared for these vehicles. That's intelligent transportation systems in cities, but also adding electric charging infrastructure to make sure that automated vehicles are able to easily use electric vehicles to serve fleet transportation needs. Some specific options that we looked at are, gathering data. Right now, we don't know a lot about how our transportation system works in a lot of ways. Automated vehicles would have the potential to really be very data rich, but we need to know how much data to ask for, how to make sure it's protected and anonymized, and that we're not then totally awash in too much data to make any decisions based on. We look at managing the curb, so deciding who can use curb when, promoting pooling, which I mentioned is this concept of being able to get multiple people into the same vehicle, which sounds pretty scary in COVID times, but we hope in a return to normalcy may become a valid option again. Using these vehicles to link and leverage transit where we have strong transit networks. Regulating transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, which will likely make some sort of a transition into automation eventually. Maybe requiring or incentivizing these vehicles to be electric and shared. I mentioned charging infrastructure, and then looking at policies that can manage congestion by pricing access. And I bring that one up here in this context because you can especially right now set these policies to have additional charges for zero occupant vehicles, for example, that would disincentivize that zombie miles problem that Stan mentioned. So I'll wrap up there. I would love to be able to get into the discussion and hear your questions and thoughts. I'll just wrap up by saying the future seems really far away, but it starts tomorrow, so we can't wait for it to be here until we make these tough policy decisions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you, Stan, again. This has been really setting the table very nicely for a discussion. We have about 22 minutes remaining. If you have questions, those in the audience, please put them in your chat box, and then we'll have the authors reflect on them and respond to them as much as they can today. And if we are not able to get to it within the available time, we'll definitely make sure we hound them and get responses to your questions and put them on the UTC page very soon. So that's the preamble. Let me just take lob a softball question to both of you. Because Austin, you said the future starts tomorrow, right? Some would contend it starts yesterday. It started yesterday, but there are many different things that need to happen in order for us to transition to an autonomous future, if at all. and there are many different issues and many different policy issues that need to be navigated. What is the first step? If you can reflect on it from your perspective for your state, and also from the federal perspective, the first step that needs to happen. If we are talking tomorrow, what do they need to do tomorrow?
I'll take that first. And, one thing that's happened in Pennsylvania is bringing everyone to the table. And we're on our third automated vehicle summit, where it's not just the automated vehicle companies and the Department of Transportation and academia. And, this is actually bringing in folks from labor. This is bringing in people from the disability community, people from the insurance industry, people from community and economic development, local mayors, bringing in these folks so that they understand what their roles are. To Austin's point, there's a lot of different roles that these different entities need to play in this, and for them to understand the impacts, as Austin was, pointing out, and understanding that so that they can start to understand their roles. I think that's the first step.
I agree. I agree. That's definitely a first step. I think one important aspect of that relates to bringing together all the different stakeholders is being explicit about what we're going to require from these vehicles. And I don't say what we want, I say require intentionally, that we want to set policy principles that we view as binding policy principles. So Stan, you mentioned the Pittsburgh Principles, which I think were outstanding. We have some federal government principles laid out. The Senate has laid out a series of principles, but they're woefully incomplete. They don't say anything about equity impacts. They don't say anything about environmental impacts. They don't say anything about congestion impacts. They are only focused on the safety, which is of course essential, but it's incomplete. So we need to know from our federal government, what are we going to demand from these? And then also be able to have layered requirements at the state and the local levels of saying, this is what we want these vehicles to do for our community and for our society. We have to put those out there. I think Pittsburgh did a great job. Everybody should have their equivalent, and it should say, we're going to make sure that if these aren't being met, we're going to require them to be met. We're going to change policy so that they will be, that they shouldn't be viewed as optional or aspirational.
Fantastic. I know these are turbulent times, so there are many questions in my mind about what we are going through and its impact on the future. But I see a question in the chat box from one of our white paper authors, Professor Kawamura, has asked, what are the states of AV development and, more importantly, adoption in other countries that you have seen?
I'll address that. Early on, there was a lot of discussion about, this is what Europe's doing, or this is what Asia's doing, or this is what United States is doing. And, what we found early on is that just as we're seeing in the US, a lot of this is still in significant pockets. And so even if we see something in the news that's happening in in Korea, it's not, these aren't deployments through nationally. And same thing with Europe and even within the city. So and then this also became, I mentioned the industry race, starting in 2013, actually starting in 2012 with the legislation in California, we got into a race of states and cities and even countries that were all competing to say, we're the most advanced in this activity. So I think we've seen a lot of competition in that regard, but I think in reality, first, the US has the most deployments, in my opinion, the most advanced deployments, in my opinion, of the technology. Secondly, what we're seeing both in the United States and these other countries are very specific deployments within a city or associated with a company or a university or one area of a testing deployment site. So I believe it's still all scattered. The companies are internationally collaborating. So we're seeing a lot of activity among the companies internationally. So I don't think we can put out a list and say, here's the top 3 nations that are leading this activity?
I think I defer. I think that makes sense to me, and Stan knows much more about that than I do. I'll add a little bit on the kind of business models and how these are being rolled out, and say that there are a couple countries, and Netherlands is top of mind, that have made some great progress on demonstrating this concept of mobility as a service, which I don't think I really did justice in my remarks, but I think it's really exciting. So that's where you would have one app or subscription that allowed you access to the full array of transportation options. And so that means, and then streamlines planning and payment of those. So that could really mean you're, taking a shared automated vehicle, but it's connecting you to a train station. And then, I'm sure Stan would love to be able to do this, gets you there, right? And you're gonna be able to just walk right onto the train. You don't have to go buy a ticket. You can take the train to Chicago. And then when you get to Chicago, you walk out of the station and your shared vehicle is there to take you to your talk or your meeting or your hotel, right? Making that much more seamless. That connectivity. I think we've seen some great progress in other countries. California has lagged way behind on that. The United States has lagged way behind on that. And it's something where if we're going to integrate automated vehicles into our transit system in a productive way, it's essential and needs to happen. So I'm hoping we can learn a lot more from those examples.
It's interesting you mentioned that the US is lagging behind. Is that it's definitely not because of technology has not been developed. It's probably because regulations are probably a lot more difficult to overcome and set in practice in the US than probably in other countries. Could that be a reason? I'm just asking a rhetorical question.
Yeah, we don't set it up with our federal funding to make it very easy or productive for transit agencies to partner with private companies. There are some partnerships that are sort of one-off with quite a few, actually. There's dozens of partnerships between transit agencies and TNCs to pilot some of this stuff, to say, we'll give your customers a credit if they begin or end their trip at a station, but it's all very one-off, right? I mean, California has been trying for literally more than a decade to make it so one card could pay for all of our transit systems. And we still don't have that. It took decades so that you could use one card to pay for all the transit in the Bay Area, which is more than 20 transit systems, right? So we have this hodgepodge of transit where we haven't done the work of coalescing it into a cohesive service. If that's not even a cohesive service, then it's hard to add in new mobility. Plus, we make it very tough in terms of federal funding to be able to have an agency say, we're going to spend some of this money to provide to a private company. Right? It's tough to know how to do that and how to make that work. So I think there are definitely policy barriers. There's also maybe some maybe I will say some, but not all transit agencies are not exactly looking progressively at the ability to use these new mobility modes. And so I think there's some institutional challenges there as well.
I agree. And if you take a centralized structure like Singapore, those types of things are much easier to implement from a top-down approach. Where in the US, especially since transit is a local service and typically locally funded, I mean, it becomes much more difficult to do, to have that centralized approach.
I was hoping that one of you would walk into that funding trap question, and Austin, thank you for walking us into it. That's the elephant in the middle of the room, right? I mean, the funding is so restrictive in the US from all accounts. And you touched upon transit systems not being progressive or not being inclusive or open-minded about other modes being part of their vocabulary. And in my opinion, of course, that's just my opinion, that it's because their hands are tied due to the funding situation, where they can spend it and how they can spend it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how the funding should really drive this, so to speak, pun totally unintended, as far as building a bridge towards an autonomous future.
Austin, do you want to take that first? Or you want me to?
Go ahead.
I think right now what the hurdle that we have with that is that a lot of these systems that are out there, even kind of personal navigation systems or systems like Waze or ones that we are all trying to optimize for the individual. and not optimized for the system. And so if you're, and that's a big difference. And even when we look into the, and because we are paying for these services, whether it's a new type of mobility as a service or the traditional type of, paying for fares. I think when we start looking at these systems more in a systematic approach and look at it as how do we optimize the entire system and not just this route for this one transit passenger or this one driver, that's when we start to be able to manage the whole transportation system as a network and not just kind of creating congestion for individuals.
I agree. I also think, where transit was in a crisis before COVID, transit's really in a crisis now with COVID, and it's not clear how it's going to emerge from that. I'm personally an enormous believer in the importance of transit and how it can uniquely provide service for people. It can do there's two things that transit can do that nothing else can do, and that's number one, provide transportation services to people who can't afford it for themselves or can't drive themselves. And number two, move a lot of people in the same direction at the same time, right? So New York City couldn't exist without transit. If you tried to build, don't listen to Robert Moses. If you want a really old reference, you can't just build bridges and make New York City work. It requires the subway. Even the Bay Area, right? It requires BART. You could not have San Francisco or Oakland without transit because you can't move that many people in the same direction at the same time without it. So I would love to see us use this opportunity to focus in on those two things. So right now, transit meets the needs of people who are otherwise unable to travel, usually with low frequency bus service. And low frequency bus service is expensive, and with paratransit. And both of those things are expensive and also not reliable ways to get around, right? So when you look at low income families in areas served by those kinds of transit, they often have to take 2 or 3 buses to get to work or to take their kids to childcare. And it's an enormous time cost and really not providing great service. So could we pool the automated services to substitute for those types of service, which are both expensive and provide poor service, and use that to let transit agencies double down on those high density routes where they provide better service than cars can, at least at a societal level. So that's what the thinking I would love to start to do. There are so many barriers between where we are now and there, but I think that's worth working on and dedicating a couple of careers to, because it's essential. Otherwise, transit is just caught between a rock and a hard place.
Perfect. I think we have a question along those lines. David Krelick from Metra, the commuter rail agency in Chicago, has a very pointed question on that particular issue that you just raised. Both of you touched upon it in your presentations about shared rides and transit. And then there's a big perception out there regarding the safety of transit as it pertains to the cleanliness of surfaces. And then David is asking, are any AV makers taking steps to try to address this? Example, automated disinfection between riders, because that's going to dictate how people are going to travel into the future.
Stan, I have 2 points to start with. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So number one is we have pretty good evidence now from other countries that have reopened after mostly containing their COVID infection rates that transit, when done carefully, is not a major vector for COVID transmission. So that's when you're careful about occupancy levels and wearing masks and disinfection, all those things. We would know now if transit was going to be a major vector. Now there's a perception issue that you're absolutely right is still very much here, and I don't know how to get beyond that. The second point about automated vehicles, this is something that I found fascinating. Stan mentioned Google's Waymo's announcement that they're going to open up service in the Phoenix area to the general public. Well, they had both safety driver and driverless versions of their pilot program. When COVID hit, they had to shut down the version with a safety driver. So if we were a little further along in automation deployment, I think what we would have seen is a huge uptick in the use of automation, because then you're able to ride in a vehicle that doesn't have another human in it. One of the big challenges to Uber and Lyft and other TNCs right now is that COVID is a huge threat to their drivers, and it's also a risk to their riders. If you're able to have a vehicle that doesn't have a driver in it, it would have dramatically changed their ability to still provide service during the heart of the COVID crisis that we're still in.
And I'll add a different take on that from the transit side to my point of, do we really need level 5 vehicles where we have no operator? You know, to the point of operators of transit vehicles have a lot more jobs to do other than just drive the vehicle. You know, they're there for the safety of the passengers, and they're there, you know, they've been doing a lot of work in cleaning the vehicles between you know, between runs, and then also just, you know, separate from COVID, you know, being there to provide assistance to people with disabilities, in order to be there if someone is, you know, acting erratically and causing a lot of fear and concern, you know, to other passengers on the bus. So there's a lot of jobs that are critical functions of the operators of transit vehicles, that even if we do have high automation, there still may be a need for a human to be able to, you know, assure the safety and comfort of, you know, and mobility of the passengers on board.
There is another question from Dr. Joe Fazio of the Urban Transportation Center, who's asking a more fundamental question about the cost of automated vehicles. We do have a lot of car ownership issues in the country. Of course, with automobile technology becoming more readily available and cheaper, that issue is slowly being addressed. But how about CAVs? Where do you put the price point? Do you see more ownership, or do you see more shared use? And how is that going to evolve?
You know, the hope, as Austin pointed out, the hope with the very highly automated vehicles, because the very highly automated vehicles require a lot more of the sensors and technology and cost, the hope is that they would be fleet owned and shared vehicles. But the lower levels of automation have been surprisingly, not just surprisingly inexpensive, in my opinion, but also surprisingly, the rate at which they've come down to the full fleet of vehicles has been really surprising. If you look at the amount of time it took for anti-lock brakes or airbags or seatbelts to be deployed all the way through a fleet, and then you look at the time that it took for backup cameras, and then now lane departure or forward collision warning, the technology is really rapidly being deployed into the existing vehicles, and we're seeing this as standard equipment on again, down to the, you know, a lot of the you know, level 1 automation into you know, a lot of the standard offerings on the full vehicle fleet.
I agree. I'd add to that, though, that one of the big equity concerns to me is that you would expect these vehicles to cost quite a bit more, but not necessarily enough more to be a complete barrier to individual ownership. And so I view this as a potential, you know, just another thing we're adding on to the difference between the haves and the have-nots in this country, where if you're able to afford a highly automated vehicle yourself, and then you're basically pushing the cost of the traffic on everybody else and not paying it yourself. And that's, I think, very problematic. It just adds to all of the other ways that our transportation system serves wealthier people better than poorer people, and people in white communities better than communities of color. And so that's, I really don't think we can let the high expected cost of the vehicle, at least in the near term, solve our problems for us.
Let me ask a different question. We have a lot of students on the call, and when they graduate, they'll be making real money. How long should they wait before deciding to buy a car that will be fully automated? Because if they buy a car that is in the market at level 2 now, what do they do with it when there is a newer upgraded version appearing in the market in the near future. So this is the spin on the usual question of how soon do you think automated vehicles will be on the market?
Well, for about the last 8 years, I've been saying that, we're going to look back one day and wonder when we ever stop driving. So I don't think it's going to be, I think with electric vehicles, it is more kind of black and white of saying, okay, I'm going to go in this year, okay, and I'm done with, combustion vehicles. I'm going to buy my first electric vehicle. Ever since the late 1980s, and they started putting OBD2 ports and computers in cars, they've slowly becoming more automated. And so there's not one point in time, it's more of a continuum with the automation. So I don't think that, year to year, it's going to be a noticeably different, different acquisition where the, where the automation is that much different. So I think it's more of a slow and steady deployment and adoption of the technology in the vehicles. So I don't think it matters when.
Austin?
I'll just put in a plug for living somewhere where you don't need to own a car. I didn't own a car for the 10 years I was in DC, and not paying for insurance or worrying about where to park it or a car getting stolen or maintenance, this is great. I have an electric car now and I like that, but I like to not having a car more.
That's a good way to wrap it up. I know there are some significant questions about the future of transit and the role of AVs, and of course, real estate, land use, location choice, living in the city versus suburb in the outset of the COVID pandemic has really changed people's perceptions. But gentlemen, these have been some excellent time that you've shared with us. You've given us a lot to chew on. Thank you so much. We are on the button at just a minute past 2 Central. Thank you for your time. If everyone can unmute their microphone and give a loud Chicago applause to both of these gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well. Ed, thank you
Yes.
so much. That went without a hitch.
Yes.
And I believe Ty Warner had a link. Maybe we can just post it on our website. Or, I don't know. Just take a look at what that is, and then we can decide
Okay.
to put it up or not. But anyway, thank you so much.
Certainly.
I'll call you later this afternoon.
Okay.
I have a 4 o'clock that appeared on my screen, so I will call you after that.
That sounds good. I'll be home.
Bye.
Okay, thanks.